How can a country overcome a crisis? How can it reinvent itself, change itself, and transform? These are two of the questions you have asked us in the comments section here on VisualPolitik. And well, dear viewer, I think we can say that the economy usually evolves through cycles. That is, a growth phase is sooner or later always followed by a crisis, and then this crisis is followed again by a new growth phase, and so on and so forth. For example, since World War II, the United States has undergone 11 complete economic cycles, that is, both growth and crisis years. However, my friends, things aren't always that simple. Sometimes leaving a crisis is very, very hard, so much so that decades could go by, so much so that even a rich and prosperous country can stop being a rich and prosperous country. Because don't think that this only affects emerging countries. Not at all. Even the richest countries can suffer this type of deep crisis, usually due to political reasons or rather bad policies. But yes, dear viewer, a country can even escape these deepest of crises. We saw it here on VisualPolitik with, for example, the case of New Zealand, which, after undergoing a very harsh crisis, managed to completely overturn their situation. Well, in this video, we're going to show you another example, and that would be the example of Canada. Yep, you heard me right. Did you know that Canada almost went bankrupt? Well, if you didn't, listen up. Canada is one of the richest, freest, and most prosperous countries with the highest quality of life on the planet. It doesn't even matter what ranking we use. It can be the United Nations HDI, the Corruption Perception Index of Transparency International, the Fraser Institute's Human Freedom Index, or the Legatum Prosperity Index. In all of them, Canada is always among the highest on the list. But this video isn't about rankings, but before we move on, I just do want to touch on one last one very quickly. See, in the latest ranking of the best countries prepared by US News Magazine and the Wharton School, Canada appears as the second best country to live in the world. So it's pretty clear, as we already saw on this channel, that Canada, dear viewer, is very, very popular right now. However, things in Canada weren't always this happy. There was a time in the 1960s, and especially in the 1970s, where everything was about to collapse.
The disaster.
For years, Canada was very similar to the United States. It was practically its twin brother. It had a very small government, the country was very decentralized, and taxes were very similar. Of course, the idea then was to compete to attract investment and thus also people from abroad, immigrants. However, this all changed in the 1960s. At that time, Canada sought to distance itself from the United States and to try a new political and economic model. The great architect of this revolution was Pierre Trudeau. Yep, that's the father of the current Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau.
And we don't intend to fool the people into thinking that we can forever spend more than we obtain from taxes. You will...
Of course, father and son's politics are by no means the same. It looks like Justin Trudeau certainly did his homework, but let's not stray from the subject too much. The fact is that Justin Trudeau's father governed Canada virtually uninterrupted between 1968 and 1984, and the fact is that throughout these 16 years in power, the country changed a great deal. See, Trudeau Sr. wanted to implement a new political model in Canada which was a bit different from Washington's capitalism and somewhat closer to Soviet Moscow's collectivism.
As against the invisible hand of Adam Smith, there has to be a visible hand of politicians whose objective it is to have the kind of society that is caring and humane. Pierre Trudeau.
In fact, in international politics, one of the things the Prime Minister was best known for was his close friendship with Fidel Castro. In any case, the truth is that we could say that Trudeau's father went a bit far. He raised taxes a lot, he increased public spending, he nationalized companies, and because he thought that all international trade and investment was bad due to competition, he decided to set up barriers. So, speaking of barriers, well, who does that sound like?
Earlier, President Trump has slapped new tariffs on imported washing machines and solar panels.
If that wasn't enough, he also made the central bank print banknotes to spare to expand credit and finance the government. And, well, maybe this recipe is starting to sound a bit familiar to you.
Well, Venezuela's adding more zeros to its currency, releasing bills with larger denominations.
Well, the result of all of this, dear viewer, is that within a few years, the deficit, unemployment, and inflation rates put the whole country up against the ropes. So, of course, when in 1984 Pierre Trudeau left office, he did so with the lowest popularity level for a Canadian Prime Minister in decades. Only 2 out of every 10 Canadians still supported him. And it was at this time that Canadian citizens had to make a really important decision.
The change.
In the September 1984 elections, the Conservatives won an overwhelming victory. It was clear that the country could not continue along Trudeau's path. The new Prime Minister, Brian Mulroney, decided to reverse the situation and began to strengthen ties with President Ronald Reagan. A new era had begun. Over the next 10 years, the Conservative government did many things to improve Canada's economy. For example, it lowered taxes, negotiated NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement that unites Canada, the US, and Mexico. And following in Margaret Thatcher's footsteps, they launched an ambitious plan to privatize large public companies such as Air Canada and Petro-Canada. However, he didn't do one thing, the most difficult and unpopular action, and that was controlling public spending. In 1990, the state held more than half of the economy. Taxes were still very high, and there was a huge public deficit, and further, public debt rose rapidly. Conservatives had taken the easiest measures, but at the moment of truth, they hadn't really shown much commitment. Therefore, in the following 1993 elections, Pierre Trudeau's leftist Liberal Party won the elections again, this time promising a true revolution. Could Pierre Trudeau's party save Canada? Given his background, you can't deny this would have been very difficult to imagine. But, well, everything was really different at this time. The new government wanted to completely change the country's model once and for all, and no, they no longer wanted anything to do with Moscow or the Soviet model. The main idea was that quality of life wasn't only related to the economy, it was dependent on it. If they wanted to achieve a high quality of life, they needed to strengthen Canada's economy. And that's essentially what they did, especially under the Minister of Finance, Paul Martin, the true change promoter. Well, the fact is that for the first few years, the leftist government launched a sharp public spending cut, eliminated many unnecessary programs, and adjusted spending. For example, they strongly reduced military spending and many company subsidies. In just 2 years, in real terms, spending dropped by 15%. Under the principle, which states that the state shouldn't do things that companies can do better, the government decided to continue with the privatization plan, in which they went as far as privatizing the railways and even the aviation management system. And no, planes in Canada did not fall out of the sky, and no, there haven't been more accidents than there have been in other countries. Indeed, on the contrary, Canada's aviation management system is considered one of the best in the world. The fact is that in just 4 years, the situation was under control. The government had gone from having a huge deficit to having a surplus. I mean, check out this graphic. Of course, as you can imagine, these measures, they weren't easy, but one thing seemed to be very clear to Canadians, so much so that in the 1997 elections, the Liberal leftist party won again by promising still more careful government spending and, on this occasion, fewer taxes. As they said, their role was to protect and give opportunities to the most disenfranchised and not to waste everyone's money. It all seems pretty sensible, don't you think? Well, listen to Paul Martin's words in 2003 as he reviewed their 10 years in power.
We have to build a 21st century economy in Canada for Canadians. We succeeded in the last 10 years because we did not deviate from our course. Balanced budgets, a continually dropping debt ratio, lower taxes. We must stay on that course. We must be a government committed to accountability, a government that treats taxpayers' money like it is your money. Paul Martin.
This revolution was a real turning point in Canada's history. The change that the country experienced in the 1980s and especially in the 90s allowed for this country's situation to change completely. Canada went from being considered an honorary member of the Third World by the Wall Street Journal due to its public debt problems to becoming the most fashionable country in the world. The Liberal Party hadn't only solved the country's problems, they had changed its model. In the following years, up until today, all political options opt for the Canadian model. Mind you, Canada is no tax haven, far from it, but they have understood that companies need to be cared for and not punished. Check this out. You heard that right. If we take all taxes that companies pay into account, this country's situation is actually very advantageous. In fact, Canada is one of the few developed countries that has been decreasing its taxes for almost 20 years to make the country more competitive. And consider, for example, how company taxes have evolved. And this policy has mostly favored the weakest. Salaries have grown a lot, and this is one of the countries that receives the most immigrants, and employment rates are very high. In addition, if all of this weren't enough, in recent years, Canada has also become a world civil liberties champion, as we saw here at VisualPolitik in a previous video. And this, dear viewer, is how Canada managed to escape its greatest crisis. And by the way, just as it happened in New Zealand and Australia, these reforms were carried out by leftist parties. But this isn't about left or right, it's about understanding that a strong, competitive, and globally open economy is the best formula to improve everyone's quality of life. But having said that, now it's your turn. Do you think Canada is a good role model? Leave your answer in the comments below, as well as in this survey, and I really hope you enjoyed this video. Please do hit that like button if you did, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel for brand new videos every Monday and every Thursday. Also, check out our friends at the Reconsider Media podcast. They provided the vocals in this episode that were not mine. And as always, thank you for watching.